Hello, my name is Valerie Keefe. I'm a screenwriter and not very successful independent television producer, but that's not the capacity in which I'm here to speak to you today. I am here to speak to you as a former politician, former president of the Grant MacEwan New Democrats, Grant MacEwan University being an important institution to the shocking but sadly true story which I'm going to relate to you now. My fellow Albertans, I'm addressing you to inform you of a serious and extra-legal deficiency in Alberta health policy. You may be surprised to learn of its existence. I was surprised to learn over a span of 18 months that no member of the Legislative Assembly, no leader of a major Albertan political party, no major media outlet was sufficiently interested in publicly acknowledging the existence of this deficiency either. This failure is not merely important on its own merits, but because of what this policy failure and the rhetoric to which Albertans are exposed in the context of this failure does to the health of our democracy. Democracies, more than anything, require an informed electorate, and the Albertan electorate has been woefully misinformed by their leadership, by elected officials of every major political party in the province as a matter of routine, and by the communication and support structures those officials enjoy. There is a fundamental deficiency in the structures our democracy relies upon, and, as a result, in our economy. And while these failures may be systemic, they are also, in many ways, personal. Like a majority of Albertans, I was, initially, pleased with the 2015 election result. A government which promised improved social justice and respect for the law, not to mention wage policy which would capture economic rents drawn by large employers of low-credential labor, and an expansionary fiscal policy in the face of an economic downturn. And they also promised common-sense climate policy and to protect vulnerable Albertans. I would not be here tonight if this government had delivered on its rhetoric to anything approaching an acceptable degree. That list I mentioned has some partial successes, but among them, far too many obstinate, obtuse, and ideology-driven failures for a government with as much power to set the agenda for the Albertan political and economic life as this government has. Over the next hour, I will explain to you how this government has enacted a policy agenda seemingly designed to ignore and further marginalize a sexual minority group to the point of costing the public healthcare dollars, to the point of causing real harm, to the point of speeding the deaths of Albertans. Vulnerable Albertans, whose lives would be dramatically improved if only four words which should be an organizing principle to a government that believes, or at least would have you believe, that it is enacting feminist principles, were recalled by the members of this government. My body, my choice. Over the next hour, I will demonstrate how this government sought to specifically ignore that principle with respect to a community whose rights many prominent New Democrats have loudly opposed. I will detail my experiences attempting to contact members of this government and members of the opposition to raise this issue, which is, ostensibly, important to the stated principles of each and every party. For the New Democratic government, inclusion of LGBTQ Albertans, protection of reproductive rights, and a centering of women's issues. For the United Conservative Party, equality of Albertans under the law, and an opposition to the frittering away of tax money, as a government rewards its friends and punishes its perceived enemies. For the Alberta Party, both inclusion and fiscal responsibility. And for the Liberal Party, evidence-driven and ostensibly LGBTQ inclusion. All of these parties have had an opportunity to make what is happening today in this province an issue. All of them have failed. Whether it is a human failure or a failure of the system humans have built, they have failed. They have failed to rectify the problem. They have failed to identify the obstacles to its solution. They have failed to even publicly recognize the existence of a problem. Some of the persons who were responsible for addressing this problem have claimed they do not know enough about this issue. I invite them to pay attention now. The Canada Health Act is our national guarantor of a universal single-payer healthcare system. It sets national standards that are to be followed, and it is the responsibility of the federal government to enforce it. Section 10 of the Canada Health Act reads, Universality. In order to satisfy the criterion respecting universality, the healthcare insurance plan of a province must entitle 100% of the insured persons of the province to the insured health services provided for by the plans on uniform terms and conditions. 100% of the insured persons of the province. Uniform terms and conditions. The emphasis is mine. The Alberta Human Rights Act governs the conduct of both private and public actors in ensuring fair treatment of all Albertans as they access the facilities and economic institutions we require to live our lives, and live our lives with dignity. Section 4 of the Alberta Human Rights Act. Discrimination regarding goods, services, accommodation, facilities. No person shall deny to any person or class of persons any goods, services, accommodation, or facilities that are customarily available to the public, or discriminate against any person or class of persons with respect to any goods, services, accommodation, or facilities that are customarily available to the public, because of the race, religious beliefs, color, gender, gender identity, gender expression, physical disability, mental disability, ancestry, place of origin, marital status, source of income, family status, or sexual orientation of that person or class of persons, or any other person or class of persons. Customarily available to the public. 100% of the insured persons. These laws sure sound like they're referring to pretty much the same group of people. These laws say it's wrong to treat people differently based on their assigned sex, especially if they're also identifying in a way that people with that assigned sex don't typically identify. A group of persons described as openly trans. Trans people, just like cis people, even like cis people who do not intend to reproduce, have reproductive medicine needs. It is popularly believed that with respect to trans people, this primary need is surgical. But data on satisfaction rates, and also the near universal presence of legal regimes and systems of discrimination which incentivize genital surgery so that as a result, the trans person will have the basic genital morphology of a cis person of the same sex, especially in the case of trans women, indicate otherwise. Hormone replacement is comparatively inexpensive. For most Albertans, the medication is not covered as a matter of course by Alberta Health Services. Either way, the cost to the province is somewhere between a one-time cost of approximately $300 for general practitioner visits and blood tests, if done through a general practitioner. 2, should the person in question receive provincial drug coverage, an ongoing cost of something in the neighborhood of $1,000 per year, which can either be expressed as twice the amount the average Canadian spends on medication, or less than 1/7 of health spending per Albertan. And these expenses are spread out over several years, during which both a growing economy and greater efficiencies and reduced patent protections for these drugs can be expected to lower their relative costs. Genital reconstruction surgery, on the other hand, is a significantly more costly affair for the province. While the stated cost of a vaginoplasty is $20,000, the reality to the Alberta Treasury, as reported to me by Barbara Curry, a researcher with the Alberta Party, is more like $120,000 because of the recovery time and care that must be provided in Montreal, one of the few places on the continent where genital reconstruction surgery, or GRS, can be routinely had. The procedure also carries dramatically higher rates of side effect and complication than HRT drugs, which, with the possible exception of testosterone, are associated with less attributable death per patient than the use of aspirin, a drug which somehow, despite the risks, we have decided Albertans are to be trusted with. Transition medicine has been shown to save lives in trans patients. Hormone replacement therapy has been used not just to treat gender dysphoria, but premenstrual dysphoria disorder, a condition affecting cis women at a time in their hormonal rhythm, during which androgens spike and estrogens fall. Untreated PMDD sufferers, just like untreated gender dysphoria sufferers, manifest depression and suicidality. This seems to indicate a common driving factor of imbalanced endocrinology acting on a portion of the brain. What part of the brain? We haven't identified the exact pathways of diversity in sexual orientation and neurological sex, just like we haven't identified every member of a gender and sexual minority, only those who are out. The brain is a complex organism, presently best understood by the reactions it manifests as we observe it, whether, like the force of gravity, we can see it operate directly or not. Our body needs, for example, a certain amount of glucose in the blood to function optimally, so it does not seem completely outlandish that the other molecules the body synthesizes, such as estrogen and testosterone, could also produce increased rates of dysfunction, even though the biology at work is neurological. So given what I have just explained to you regarding cost, safety, and evidentiary and scientific basis for treatment, not to mention the legal rights I've just explained belong to every Albertan entitled to use Alberta health services, you might be interested to know what the state of provision of transition medicine is in Alberta. You might actually have your assumptions. You might not even have a definite picture in mind, but you may have a belief as to the process being followed, especially given the public statements of this government. I will remind you of them now. On May 4th of this year, in response to the question of an early election call, in contravention of legislation guaranteeing fixed election dates, Premier Notley said, "I can understand that the people of Alberta would not be, on the basis of the previous government's behaviour, used to a government that thinks it's their job to follow the law. I'm kind of a law-friendly person. I like law. Law is fun. Where stuff is there, you should follow it. And so, it's my intent to follow both the spirit as well as the letter of the law, because that's what I think you should do. That's what I've said before, and that's what I'm saying again now." And on October 24th, the Premier said, in response to the plan of the Edmonton and Calgary Catholic School Boards to write a sex education curriculum which omitted discussions of gender and sexual minorities, as well as provided a more nuanced teaching of the concept of sexual consent, the Premier was uncategorical in her condemnation. She said, "We will not use public dollars to have sexual health programs that deny science, deny evidence, that deny human rights." With that, I give you the state of hormone replacement therapy access in Alberta. For cis patients, acquiring hormone replacement therapy typically requires informed consent from one's family doctor and an absence of absolute contraindications. For trans patients, acquiring hormone replacement therapy typically entails having one's family doctor express discomfort providing you medication on an informed consent basis, and thus referring you to a psychiatrist, whom, after evaluating you for a period which is highly variable in length and arbitrary requirement, decides whether or not you are suffering from gender dysphoria, who then refers you to an endocrinologist, who determines an absence of both absolute and other contraindications to their satisfaction. Absolute contraindications indicate a severe risk of harm should the medicine be taken. An example of this is the presence of a cancer whose growth is aggravated by the presence of certain hormones. Other non-absolute contraindications indicate the potentiality of future issues that a patient should be made aware of. How much are non-absolute contraindications used as a pretext to deny helpful medicine in the case of hormone replacement for trans patients? Well, I can't say for certain, other than to say I have spoken to people who are rebuffed by gatekeepers for having depression and social anxiety. It's worth noting that long-term studies on the efficacy of transition show dramatic reductions in depression prevalence on the order of 90%, which is higher than those produced by antidepressants. So because they have a condition predicated by a lack of treatment, certain well-paid specialists are using that as an opportunity to deny their patients treatment. It's worth noting doctors don't have to refer trans patients to this convoluted, expensive, and counterproductive system. They're just presented with the option, and take it with near uniformity. This, despite the ethics code of the Alberta College of Physicians and Surgeons. I quote, "Initiating and dissolving a patient-physician relationship. In providing medical service, do not discriminate against any patient on such grounds as age, gender, marital status, medical condition, national or ethnic origin, physical or mental disability, political affiliation, race, religion, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status. This does not abrogate the physician's right to refuse a patient for legitimate reasons. Refusal to treat neurological distress from lack of estrogen in trans women while treating neurological distress from lack of estrogen in cis women would not qualify as a legitimate reason, and yet that discrimination persists. What's more, these delays in receiving treatment are seemingly motivated more by a concern that trans people might seek transition, but might not seek genital reconstruction surgery. Other popular names for this procedure are sexual reassignment surgery, gender reassignment surgery, and gender confirmation surgery. These names indicate a belief that sex is genital and not neurological. Now, perhaps I have been going to the wrong singles bars, but I'm fairly sure that genital morphology plays a comparatively minor role in relationship formation. Surely a stronger argument can be made for centering neurology, but humans, creatures of technical knowledge and habit, have, long before and long after Galileo was forced to admit the primacy and staticness of the Earth in our solar system, been resistant to updating our models as we learn and observe more. Instead, we cling to tautology, truths presented as inviolable and self-evident with no real basis for this level of faith, other than that it has commonly been believed to be true. This kind of belief can even extend to highly trained professionals who specialize in the relief of suffering caused by it. At a conference of United Kingdom National Health Service Transition Provision Professionals in 2009, a doctor at Leicester Gender Identity Clinic spoke to the group about, in their words, the issue of unintentionally creating she-men. The doctor went on to describe the term they had coined as patients who have breasts and are on hormones but don't have, quote-unquote, final surgery. This concern was echoed by other specialists. That's right, folks. The people in charge of giving trans people medicine in the United Kingdom, one of the most advanced single-payer systems in the world, has, as of at least 8 years ago, not cottoned on to the simple, if anti-tautological message that some girls have penises. Or at least they have not learned to hide their willful ignorance as well as this government. The focus of gatekeepers on genital reconstruction, which they describe as quote-unquote final surgery, mandates that to be recognized as female, a trans woman must risk her sexual function and health for an expensive operation with a non-trivial risk of serious complications, and then dilate for the remainder of her life so that she might better resemble a cis woman, should anyone think to look down there. It should not be difficult for anyone who identifies as a feminist to be horrified by that kind of treatment, and yet our government finds a way to stow its theoretical concern. Our government makes naloxone available over the counter to reduce the risk of harm to opiate users, and funds safe injection sites for the same reason. Our government makes mifenymiso, a pill which can terminate a pregnancy, available to pregnant persons without charge. Our government spends money making sure that trans patients seeking the right to buy medicine, safer than both of these medications, must be gotten through 2 specialists, at an average wait time now of 2 years. Longer than any Albertan government this century, it is also worth noting. But wait, folks, they're coming to the rescue. In multiple letters I have received from the Premier's Office, the Ministry of Health, and the Status of Women's Ministry, the government is proud to tout action. What action are they taking? Currently, the Ministry is collaborating with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta to improve awareness of general practitioners who can provide transgender-related health services. We are also working with the University of Alberta, MacEwan University, and Alberta Health Services to develop a primary care medical home clinic, expected to open in the fall of 2017. This clinic will focus on trans healthcare, coordinate links to specialists, and be a core teaching site for training healthcare providers. So, they're reminding doctors that they have the option of doing their jobs, and they're building a primary clinic for all the people who make trans patients go through a psychiatrist and endocrinologist for medicine cis people get effectively on demand. Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, said that if you want more of something, subsidize it. This government, in building a primary care clinic, instead of rectifying the refusal of doctors to do their damned jobs, a refusal, it's worth noting, that is enabled by this government, is subsidizing people whose job is to deny and delay basic reproductive freedom for trans people. In essence, The government is building a space for all the specialists squicked by so-called she-men and anyone else who doesn't follow their outdated, sexist, arbitrary model of denial of treatment. Our government is spending money to build gatekeepers at Clubhouse to compare notes, but I'm sure that's balanced out by all the butterflies and rainbows we'll doubtless see. If butterflies bring on acceptance of trans Albertans, bring us more butterflies. But the truth is that they don't. This government knows what it's doing is illegal, but it simply does not care, because it has comparatively little fear of enforcement. There is, at present, a 4 to 5 year backlog for the resolution of human rights complaints. That means, quite simply, that Premier Notley will be sticking her successor with the bill for her promises. Again. As evidenced by the public statements of this health minister, when it comes to the enforcement of the law, ministers of this government care far more that more than 5 people might be protesting outside an abortion clinic's operation in one place, or that they might be protesting too closely, than that Alberta Health Services is spending money maintaining a system of 2-tier healthcare that most harms the women least able to fight back against it. I think most trans women would take an awkward interaction with the powerless over 2 years of wait time. So I would ask the Premier, the Status of Women's Minister, the Health Minister, and the Associate Minister this. Would cis women like to trade? We'll take people comfortable with telling us they don't believe in what we're doing with our bodies, as though outside a clinic is the only time that happens. And cis women can take the 2-year wait and mandatory psych assessment to get birth control, abortion, or hormone replacement. How about it? So, trans Albertans face longer waits for medicine that's more beneficial to them, and the only reason offered for treating the same treatment, hormone replacement, differently, is that the patients are trans. But the Canada Health Act says the healthcare insurance plan of a province must entitle 100% of the insured persons of the province to the insured health services provided for by the plans on uniform terms and conditions. And the medical evidence says that HRT does more good for trans patients than cis patients. And the Alberta Human Rights Act says that no person shall discriminate against any person or class of persons with respect to any goods, services, accommodation, or facilities that are customarily available to the public, because of the gender, gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation of that person or class of persons, or any other person or class of persons. And the Premier says, I'm kind of a law-friendly person. I like law. Law is fun. Where stuff is there, you should follow it. And so it's my intent to follow both the spirit as well as the letter of the law, because that's what I think you should do. That's what I've said before, and that's what I'm saying again now. The Premier also says, we will not use public dollars to have sexual health programs that deny science, that deny evidence, and that deny human rights. Strong stuff, Premier Notley. It's really a shame that these are outright lies, and that you are responsible for willfully uttering them to the people of Alberta. Your trans health policy is a sexual health program. It denies science, instead centering the arbitrary recommendations of a group of specialists with 6-figure salaries who have spent decades inserting themselves between trans people, especially trans women, and the medicine they need. It denies evidence and directs ease of access to those for whom the medicine carries a higher ratio of risk to reward. And what's more, it denies human rights, even the provisions of the Alberta Human Rights Act, which your government took a great deal of credit for amending. You have lied to the people of this province, Madam Premier. You and your colleagues in the New Democratic caucus have lied to the people of this province every time you told them you would protect and respect reproductive rights of women and LGBTQ rights. What you clearly meant, as evidenced by the actions of this government, was that you would respect the reproductive rights of the female assigned so long as you approved of the choice they made, and entrenched barriers to the reproductive rights of people for whom prominent members of your party and the federal New Democrats have long expressed contempt and condescension. And if you don't believe me, Madam Premier, then the next time we meet to discuss this issue, which will be the first time, we can discuss the 1996 column of prominent New Democrat Michelle Landsberg, spouse of Stephen Lewis, who is former leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party, recipient of the YWCA Women of Distinction Award, Media Watch's Dodie Robb Award, the Robertine Berry Prize from the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, the Canadian Governor-General's Award in commemoration of the 1929 Persons Case and Democratic Development, and several honorary degrees which consist of a list too large to fully repeat here, though it includes both McMaster and York universities. On the Nixon versus Vancouver rape relief case, entitled Rape Crisis Center Endures Assault, the very prominent New Democrat, Ms. Landsberg, wrote, "What makes a woman? If a man cuts off his penis, pumps himself full of hormones, gets silicone breasts and electrolysis, and stuffs his feet into high heels, is he/she a woman? To me, that surgically and chemically altered person is a walking testament to the craziness of our cultural rigidity. If all children weren't crammed into pink or blue categories with prescribed sets of feelings, beliefs, and behaviors, maybe the gender ambiguous wouldn't be driven to such painfully harsh medical extremes. Would that everyone could live freely in freely chosen sexual modes, without mutilations and lifelong chemicals." Premier Notley, I'm fairly certain that when you saw a far more crude and brief example of this kind of behavior from a Facebook commenter, and not a widely regarded leader of the Canadian cis feminist movement, you felt confident calling the opposition cowards for tolerating that speech. If you wish, I can present examples that are far more recent. I can present examples that even include persons who teach at a major institution of post-secondary credentialing in our province. I have been told by a supporter of a member of your cabinet that if I did not like the current system of hormone replacement gatekeeping, I could go to Thailand. Cis feminist, heal thyself. I would also further ask those watching to consider, if this government fundamentally agreed with the assertions of Ms. Landsberg when faced with the policy decision whether or not to entrench barriers to hormone replacement, or, as Ms. Landsberg calls them, lifelong chemicals, chemicals which the body produces as a result of biological processes, but which inherently require regular supplementation, and when faced with the policy decision of teaching Albertan children non-traditional gender presentation in a drama supplement previously referred to as Drag 101, if a government didn't believe that trans people just needed to really queer it up instead of transition, would it restrict transition medicine and entrench barriers to that restriction while teaching Albertan children drag presentation? If this government didn't believe that transition was not the sign and signal of a failure of anti-sexist policy, would it behave thusly? I do not believe that it would. I do not think any reasonable person willing to engage with the evidence of what New Democrats have said and done about access to hormone replacement, have said about centering violence against the female assigned, whom it should be noted are at less risk of violence than the general population, what they have said about centering and valorizing and oftentimes misrepresenting forms of identification which simultaneously reject cisness and transition, could honestly believe that they want to acknowledge in any appreciable way the extent to which trans people, especially trans women, actually exist. They would very much like to perpetuate the fiction that to be LGBTQ is to be openly LGBTQ, even if only to oneself, and that to be trans is to wear leggings or a bow tie. The reason New Democrats do this is because their gender ideology is that there is no inherent differentiation of the brain of any kind with respect to sex or orientation. To them, sexual oppression is a result of assignment and broadly understood category, and not the reading of the kind of neurology which would cause cis women on a progesterone-only birth control pill to report more depression, or cis women with exceptionally androgenic menstrual cycles to report more depression, or trans patients who access hormone replacement therapy to report an order of magnitude less depression than they previously suffered before accessing the medicine. The gender ideology is cisfeminism, a belief that the primary victims of sexism are the female assigned and that they are primarily cis women. Their belief is that to the extent that the male assigned suffer, their suffering is largely self-imposed through standards that are core to the benefit the male assigned receive, benefit that leads to the male assigned being more homeless, more jailed, more assaulted, more abused, and more murdered than the people they're supposed to be oppressing. And that is, quite plausibly, how we get drag class and gatekeeping out of the same government simultaneously. Legacy of bigoted attitudes aside, I have attempted to contact elected public servants and their employees about this issue in person, via phone, and via email. The Premier's office, in the letter I previously quoted, asked me to contact Blair Christensen, Ministerial Assistant to the Minister of Health and Associate Minister of Health, by telephone. At one point, in the first of two exceedingly short conversations we had in discussing the civil rights aspect of this policy practice, I asked her, I am paraphrasing, does the Canada Health Act not pretty clearly illustrate the illegality of what you're doing? Under its universality provision, it says you can't differentiate treatment. By differentiate, I meant apply different terms and conditions to different groups on the basis of their assigned sex and identified sex. I asked her if the Alberta Human Rights Act didn't make this kind of discrimination in provision of medicine illegal. Again, to reiterate, I asked these questions of the Ministerial Assistant to the Minister of Health and the Associate Minister of Health. And she told me she was not familiar with either act. I asked if I should call later, when she had time to familiarize herself with the act, maybe grab a cookie. I hadn't mentioned the cookie directly to Ms. Christensen. I merely think it a funny reference at the end of what is a long and very sad affair. We concluded the call. I phoned back no less than a week later, asked Ms. Christensen if she had familiarized herself with the act. She said she had not. I detailed the stunning level of stonewalling I had to encounter as I worked to get the government to answer questions about the legality of its own actions and the pain this disingenuous display caused, and terminated the second call. I shouldn't, someone who has survived this brand of quiet abuse myself, have to be subject to gaslighting, ignoring, withholding, and stonewalling behavior from my own government. Nor should this abuse have to be inventoried. Nor should this abuse receive no direct apology when inventoried. More importantly, those persons in this province whom the government of this province accuses of being deficient of ethics and compassion should not be subject to this behavior either. I should say, in asking about the Alberta Human Rights Act and Canada Health Act as they relate to entrenching a system where two groups of people, separated only by assigned sex, face radically different standards to access the same medicine, that I asked these questions not just because the government was very vocal about the importance of making trans protections, which already existed before the Alberta Human Rights Amendment Act, or Bill 7, explicit, not just because the Canada Health Act is one of the primary laws that upholds Canada's system of social guarantees, in this case universal health care, but because a great deal of energy and emotion had been expended by New Democrats over the fact that the Klein government had been violating the Canada Health Act to undermine single-payer universal health care. To hear them speak, and it was around that time that I was a card-carrying New Democrat, it was unacceptable, and it was from a place of unchecked privilege, and it was wrong. Premier Notley, let me again be clear. Your government has been violating the Canada Health Act to undermine single-payer, universal health care. Wait times for hormone replacement therapy, a prescription pad medicine that has lower rates of attributable harm per patient than aspirin, have more than doubled since 2010. Your government owns the longest HRT wait times for trans patients of any Albertan government this century. Wait times so that people can buy medicine. Wait times that cost the people of Alberta money. This is unacceptable. This is from a place of unchecked privilege, and this is wrong. What's even more wrong is that you could have been stopped at any time in the past year and a half by an opposition paying any attention, but they declined, all for their own reasons, to publicly make a case of a government spending more money so that members of the sexual minority would get less medicine. I called the progressive conservative status of women's critic, now the infrastructure minister. I asked her repeatedly to raise this question in the House, and at no time did she explicitly acknowledge my request, instead asking me, after I had educated a previous assistant, to educate a new assistant on the issue, which she had already asked in a private letter the Associate Minister of Health to, quote, show leadership on. For future reference, for those subjected to it, this form of quiet emotional abuse, where the person committing the abuse consistently refuses to acknowledge your concerns or criticism, is known as ignoring behavior. When now Minister Jansen left the Progressive Conservative leadership race over angry pushback due to her uncritical promotion of the GSA program, I wrote her a letter in which I asked her to consider that anger in the context of a GSA program which would, by its nature, serve to problematize those LGBTQ Albertans who did not have the social capital to get out of the closet. There was no response. Eventually, I referred to her as a coward, and as someone who cares more when cis women are insulted than when trans women are denied basic reproductive medicine causing death. I see no reason to withdraw or apologize for those statements or similar remarks that I have made to the same extent as Minister Jansen has produced no evidence that any of these assertions are untrue. The next progressive conservative status of women's critic was no more aid, declining to raise this issue or other issues of structural transmisogyny during the status of women's ministry estimates, even though a gender-based analysis of transition gatekeeping would demonstrate that countries which restrict transition more tend to have lower ratios of out-trans women to out-trans men than those countries which restrict transition less. It was less an issue of structural transmisogyny It was an issue of structural transmisogyny that ran counter to the government's message, and it was financially costly. Not worth a mention, though. I spoke to some very helpful receptionists in the Wild Rose Caucus about the spending of taxpayer money to impede delivery of medicine. Things went no further. With respect to the Alberta Party, Mr. Clark says his party is unideological or centrist and believes in fiscal responsibility and social inclusion. I spent the most time and energy attempting to convince Mr. Clark to raise this issue, but nearly all of it was spent with his director of caucus research, Barbara Curry, who was unflappable, went about her job with a sense of humor and pathos, and who never went two calls refusing to confirm the content of any legislation. She commiserated with me when I expressed consternation that Minister Clark, despite knowing what was happening to trans medicine, through her efforts, still managed to get more publicly angry when someone in this province burned a pride flag than when the people that flag was supposed to represent were harmed by a government spending money, somewhere around $1 million a year, to deny them medicine, contrary to provincial and federal law. Mr. Clark, if it will get you to finally publicly care. It was explained to me that Mr. Clark felt that with as few resources as the Alberta Party had, that its discussions had to remain relevant to the news cycle. I would only say that leaders need to lead the conversation and not simply pander to it. I approached Nathan Cooper's office on the public understanding that Mr. Cooper supported LGBTQ rights, just not the ideology of this government. Mr. Cooper did not reply. I approached Eric Fildebrandt's office since he should definitely, in seeking to serve the interests of the public purse, be concerned in proportion to the money that was being wasted by a government to assuage powerful groups which had an interest in the present state of affairs. Mr. Fildebrandt did not reply. I've called the Kenny campaign I've called the Gene campaign. I've confronted Mr. Schweitzer about the gap between his rhetoric and his issue profile. No reply. United Conservatives, who are neither, you say you don't hate LGBTQ people. You say you're concerned with equal treatment under the law, government overregulation, and waste. Oh, and you've been accused by the government of anti-LGBTQ bigotry. So, this issue was tailor-made for you. And yet you said nothing. Even if this government is unwilling to recognize its own core of bigotry, its own grab bag of easy answers unburdened by proof or scrutiny, maybe it's right about you. Maybe you think if you're quiet enough and dismissive enough, you can just inherit this government due to the toxicity of this government. I don't believe that's worthy of us. Liberal leader David Kahn has been willing to have extended conversations on the issue in private. Liberal leader David Kahn has thus far not been willing to make a public statement on this government's discriminatory, harmful, two-tier women's health care. Though he has retweeted the issue a couple times when I've raised it. I do not believe this is a remotely sufficient public response from a person with the platform that Mr. Kahn and the Liberal Party of Alberta have. The manifest wrongness of what is occurring is not presently sufficient to make him comfortable speaking out. Maybe one day, if this became headline news. Bill Ma and Dave Breckenridge, managing editors of the Edmonton Journal, declined to run a column on this issue I wrote in June, though I did, the afternoon of the 16th of November, a few hours before taping this address, receive a request for a revised column. Emily Rendell Watson of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation cut this aspect of the issue with HRT access from her report on the issue. I said then into the camera, as I am saying now into the camera, that this government is violating laws it passed to deny vulnerable Albertans medicine at public expense. Then she interviewed the chief gatekeeper in the city, someone whom I can tell you from the personal experience of having my endocrinologist referral delayed for wearing pants and a sweater to my initial consult in January of 2010 is influenced by sexist standards. As well as Marnie Panis, a quote-unquote diversity advisor for Alberta Health Services, who, among other jobs she does for this government, goes to Alberta schools and tells closeted teenagers to check their cishet privilege. That's not journalism. That's the trading of preservation of an existing narrative for access. That's not journalism. That's what economist Paul Krugman describes as affinity fraud. That's not journalism, that's fake news. And that's what brings me to the reason that I've spent the last hour talking to you about a tiny program that costs about $1 million a year when this province spends billions and billions. Why is this issue important? This issue isn't just important because vulnerable people are being denied the right to pay for something that can benefit them merely because of the prejudices of people in power. This issue isn't just important because public money is being spent so that fewer people get medicine. This issue isn't just important because it comes with its very own body count. This issue is important because it lays bare the systemic failures of our political and economic system, the way in which it is broken, the way in which it is rigged. This travesty has been allowed to continue because of behaviors that have typified the neoliberal era, not to mention this province's government, this legislature's opposition, and this province's media. None may necessarily believe themselves to be defenders of this particular system, but they all operate from its fundamental preconceptions, and that is why they have believed that just so long as they are nice in public, they haven't done anything wrong. This approach is exemplified by the New Democratic Party's co-opted activist for the rights of those who have transitioned, Marnie Panis. Ms. Panis is a senior diversity and inclusion advisor for Alberta Health Services. Recently, she said, in relation to the province's sexual health education policy, if a cis woman was asked to an Alberta school to talk women's rights, would the superintendent require parental consent? Why am I different? Powerful words again. Except, when asked about barriers to hormone replacement therapy, Ms. Panis had this to say. We're looking at redeveloping all 4 years of curriculum we're looking at redeveloping 4 years of curriculum to include diversity throughout all 4 years for all diverse populations. So, to review, Ms. Panis, when you're denied the opportunity to speak in front of a group of people, you think the appropriate action is to immediately point out the hypocritical and manifest wrongness of this behavior. When a government violates its own laws and federal law to allow doctors to keep violating their code of ethics, you believe we should teach people in med school about diversity some more. Marnie, if a cis woman were to ask her doctor for hormone replacement therapy, would Alberta Health Services have a de facto requirement of approval from a psychiatrist and then referral to an unnecessary endocrine specialist, given the relative safety of the drug? Why are women who have an access transition different from cis women? Why are women who have an access transition different from you and I? Why don't they have a right to this medicine, and why haven't you, at any point, decided to place your position as a paid consultant for this government behind the rights of those trans women? How are your actions different? And finally, Ms. Panis, given the logic of your actions and the upset you have expressed at the discrimination you face, shouldn't we change the way we educate teachers until we get a superintendent who acts in the inclusive manner you desire? Or is that not a sufficiently immediate time frame? For you, I mean, not the women dying from lack of medicine safer than aspirin. Madam Premier, members of the legislature, senior figures in every major party in this province, it's not nice to quietly abuse people. It's not being the adult in the room. And what's more, it's not even clever. It builds and builds an angry backlash which threatens to sweep away everything you hold dear. And I believe you hold more dear than simply the privileging of cis women over trans women, though make no mistake, it is privilege. You owe an apology to the people of this province. The opposition owes an apology to the people of this province. Powerful figures in media owe an apology to the people of this province. None of you, however, are willing to apologize. And all of you instead deflect to the very good reasons for doing what you were doing and are doing. I had very good reasons for doing what I was doing as well, so I will apologize. People of Alberta, I'm sorry that I identified a systemic failure in our democracy, that I encountered a government lying to its own people, and then making villains of those who chose the impolitic side of a disingenuous choice. I'm sorry that for 18 months I, in seeking to help someone who I've been trying to get access to this medicine for 7 years, felt that I would have done enough if I'd addressed this small issue, one where there is an absolute right and an absolute wrong and an absolute refusal of anyone who matters to be honest with themselves and the people they seek to serve. I'm sorry that, for the past 13 years, I have largely abdicated my responsibility to directly oppose misinformation in the Albertan and Canadian political arena. I've written letters, I've phoned people, I have comfortably commentated from the sidelines, but I have not done that which I know I am, it would seem, uniquely able to do, to stand up and speak. In doing so, I have stood by while the government presents structural rape erasure and abuse erasure of male-assigned survivors as a bold new initiative to protect survivors. I have made it easier for this government to harm survivors. I have made it easier for abusers to harm their victims. To the survivors of violence that this government continually victim blames, I apologize. In doing so, I have allowed a government free rein to maintain an arts policy that makes it harder for independent artists to make art, instead directing millions to those who can afford to spend millions. To the artists we need to hear from most and instead see the least, I apologize. In doing so, I have enabled this government to cement the idea that reconciliation is best achieved by opening their speeches with the numbers of treaties which countless governments in the name of the Crown have violated, while refusing the governments of Indigenous persons those treaties were ostensibly written to protect, equal status, to discuss those issues at First Ministers' meetings. I enabled members of this government to decide for themselves that co-optation and revisionist history was the same thing as respect and reconciliation. For that I am sorry. In doing so, I have allowed the opposition to fail to acknowledge that this government's carbon tax, by incentivizing the importation of goods, in not taxing carbon emissions used to produce out-of-province goods, by refusing to tax exportation of carbon-emitting petrochemicals, by structurally incentivizing the production of fuels which emit methane, which warm the planet faster than the carbon-heavy fuels they replace, and by picking a series of carbon mitigation eco-winners and losers, which did not include managed grazing, which would help our semi-arid southern grasslands to improve their ability to capture greenhouse gases, or thermal depolymerization, which would allow us to tackle some of our largest methane emitters, landfills, will likely accelerate climate change. I am especially, not solely, sorry to those people who live in the developing world in areas prone to flooding due to sea level rise. I abdicated my responsibility to you, because I thought the small amount of honesty that might come about in addressing this issue might produce enough systemic change to make me personally comfortable with the work I'm trying to do. I know I can say I'm only one person, and that I'm not paid to make the world a better place. But my silence helped make the world a less safe place. My silence made World War III ever so slightly, incrementally more likely. I also know that I abdicated my responsibility to push this government to reform our basic economic structures so that more stakeholders would have more leverage and markets would less frequently fail, and so that more of our work would actually be guided towards making the world a better place, about making us all richer, and thereby profiting ourselves. Instead, I let them continue to pour tens of billions of dollars into a bloated system of credential inflation, rewarding their already credentialed friends, as Albertans struggle to keep up with an economy that demands they have better credentialing for jobs that are not better, not economically efficient to preserve, and for that matter, as we have found with those in positions of influence who speak out and are rapidly ostracized, do more to restrict intellectual freedom. That is not education. That is a paper chase. This is not only not the bright future we were promised, this is not the bright present of which we are capable. I'm sorry I thought we could do this piece by piece. And I'm sorry I thought I could play their game. It's become incredibly clear that we have to change the game. And we have to do so in ways that recognize why our current system is failing. We need a very long, very complex conversation that we have consistently been refusing to have as Albertans and as Canadians. I'm sorry. Like all of the persons I have castigated tonight for not doing enough, I have not done enough. I have had good reasons. We have all had good reasons. Mine include that, as a result of my then untreated dysphoria, as well as some technical complications, such as an inability to receive bank statements for an account which I had foreclosed without spending additional money that I had not raised or not had the right to donate to my own campaign, I did not have the emotional capacity or the energy necessary to successfully navigate the system required to file for the roughly $1,000 in donations and expenses involved with my campaign for Parliament as a progressive Canadian in Edmonton Centre in 2004. I maintain that the law was designed to make it impressively difficult for political actors without large degrees of institutional support to become involved in the system, but I failed to conform to it, or to give my agent the resources needed to conform to it, and the people of this country are entitled to the best accounting I can give of it, but that is for a future date. I merely mention it now because I failed to do that which I think our leaders ought to do, and because I believe we cannot improve if we do not take responsibility, something our leaders thus far refuse to do, as they continue to mislead the public and disingenuously distort their positions and their opponents' positions. I tell you that this all was my responsibility, and I failed. I'm sorry. I know I've also failed to identify many of the ways in which the hijacking of our democracy has harmed Albertans, and I'm sorry for that too. But at least I intend to begin to help rectify that failure, because I know there's more than one place in which this prejudice-led government and cowardice-led opposition have refused to find courage and equanimity while laws are broken, while public money is wasted, while people are left to suffer and die. I know they exist, but I also know I haven't heard of all of them yet, because they've yet to be presented to me in the comfort of my living room. So in the coming days and weeks, I'll have more to say about the problems facing this government and the people of Alberta, and hopefully how to fix them. But until then, feel free to let me know what I and other public citizens should be apologizing for by using the hashtag #SorryAlberta. The first step in solving any problem is identifying its existence, and I invite you to join me in doing just that. Thank you for your time.